Don't forget to subscribe and comment to be entered into our weekly shoutout. Now first up on the list is Danny Granger out of Indiana. When Danny Granger was 25 years old, he was getting all kinds of buckets. In the 2009 season alone, Danny Granger was putting up 25 points a game, 5 rebounds, 2 assists, and he was making 2 threes a game. But that wasn't all for Danny Granger that season. He became a first-time All-Star and the most improved player in the league. But let me put things into perspective of what Danny Granger accomplished that season. Only 12 players in NBA history have ever averaged 25 points, 5 rebounds, and at least 2 threes per game. That list of 12 players includes people like Kobe, Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant, James Harden, and even Tracy McGrady. Needless to say, Danny Granger was an absolute monster at 25 years old. One could even argue that Granger was a little ahead of his time. Since the NBA now has exploded with the three-pointer, he would have been deadly. If you take a look at Granger's early career, he was doing great, and he was only improving from there. I mean, he scored 7 points in year 1, 13 points per game in year 2, and 19 points per game in year 3. And by year 4, he was putting up 25 points per game at the age of 25. For me, those stats represent someone who was just entering their prime and was well on their way to become one of the best scorers in the NBA. But unfortunately, this was not the case for Granger at all. At age 29, he only played 5 games and only averaged 5 points per game. But the source of the problem for Danny was actually pretty simple. His knees just weren't what they used to be. In 2013, he had a left knee injury that he could never recover from. This was tragic because the Pacers lost to the Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals in Game 7 without Granger. The Pacers lost yet again to the Heat in the Eastern Conference Finals in 6 games this time. I personally think that if Granger would have been healthy, they could have easily beat the Heat and brought home a championship to Indiana. But this was not able to happen because of Granger's injuries. I do have to mention, however, that I really do respect the way Granger handled himself off the court. He was a great teammate even through his injury. Paul George even went on to mention that Danny Granger was a mentor to him when he entered the league. He even said that he calls Danny from time to time. Next up on this list is Ben Gordon out of Chicago. Out of all the players mentioned on this list, the craziest story is definitely Ben Gordon's. Ben Gordon really was one of the best perimeter players in the league, and when he got hot, I mean, this guy was unstoppable. Already at the age of 25, he was already averaging 28 points per game. He especially proved his superstar potential when they played the Boston Celtics in the first round of playoffs. Ben was really the go-to guy when the Bulls needed a bucket. I mean, in Game 2 alone, Gordon had 42 points. With the help of Ben Gordon, they almost defeated the Celtics, which would have been a huge upset. The Celtics did beat the Bulls in Game 7, but the future seemed like it was only getting better for Ben Gordon. A team who believed in Gordon was the Detroit Pistons, and they thought he had a bright future ahead as well. Detroit even ended up signing him for a 5-year, $58 million contract. But unfortunately for Detroit, it just seemed like Ben Gordon just wanted to get paid and leave. Every time he got the checks, he just seemed like he wasn't interested in playing anymore. All Gordon had to say for himself was that he was a little confused with the offense and that he wasn't getting enough minutes to prove himself. It just doesn't make any sense how a player goes from 25 points per game in 2009 down to 13 points per game in 2010. Gordon was only 26 years old and only helped the Pistons win 25 games that year. And to make matters worse, those 13 points per game were the highest points he would ever have in a season ever again. So Ben Gordon actually left the NBA at the age of 31. But unfortunately for Gordon, his problems didn't stop once he left the basketball court. In June of 2017, he was arrested for pulling his fire alarm at his apartment building. Whoa, what? And just a few months later, he was back at it again, arguing with a woman, and that actually got him placed in a psychiatric hospital. As if things couldn't get worse for Gordon, he actually punched his apartment manager in the face and robbed him of the security deposit. Needless to say, this is a tragic story, and if Ben Gordon does suffer from mental health issues, I really hope he gets the help he needs. Anyway, up next is Amar Stoudemire. Amar Stoudemire quickly began to dominate the league when playing with the Phoenix Suns and the quick 7-second offense. I mean, this man was already part of the NBA second team at the age of 22. In his third season alone with the Suns, he was already averaging 26 points per game, 9 rebounds, and had a player efficiency of 26. Amar Stoudemire definitely played a key role playing alongside with Steve Nash, and together they actually led the Suns to the Western Conference Finals 3 times in a row, and Amari himself was actually named an All-Star 5 times. When Amari was in his prime time, it seemed like there really was games where he just couldn't be stopped by anyone on the court. He really had unmatched athleticism, he had a great feel for the game, a great touch around the basket, and I mean his mid-range game was just simply unstoppable. But in the summer of 2010, Amari decided to pack things up in Phoenix and head over to New York. The fans over there really thought that he was going to be able to save the Knicks. And Amari definitely didn't let the Knicks fans down. In his first season playing in the Garden, he had already been dropping 25 points per game and actually led the Knicks to the playoffs for the first time in 7 years. But after that, problems started to happen for Amar Stoudemire. He was still struggling with knee injuries that he had gotten while playing in Phoenix. And the insurance companies actually didn't want to pay the $100 million contract that Amari was offered. This was a pretty big red flag, and it actually didn't end up paying off for the Knicks anyway, because Amari went from scoring 25 points per game only down to 17 points per game. Amari only played 46 games that season, and the next season it actually dropped down to 27 games. He was also only down to scoring 14 points per game, which at 30 years old was a huge disappointment since a couple years earlier he was considered one of the best players in the league. From there, we all know that Amari was never really able to recover from his injuries, and many Knicks fans were actually pretty upset because they saw his contract as a complete waste. I do gotta say though, this is a shame because it would have been nice to see what Melo and Stoudemire would have done together. But the NBA is a harsh place where injuries can and actually do end careers. Anyway, moving on, next up on this list is Deron Williams. In the 2017 NBA Finals, it was pretty clear that one player did not deserve to be there at all. During those 5 NBA Finals games, Deron Williams might have had one of the worst NBA Finals series of all time. He was averaging 12 minutes per game and only put up 1 point and 1 assist per game. He also had an embarrassing 13% from the field, so it shouldn't surprise you that Deron Williams is really no longer in the NBA. But if we ignore the fact that he had a terrible NBA's final performance, it's actually pretty crazy that Deron Williams isn't on any NBA team right now. I mean, when this man was in his prime, people would legit argue if he was better than Chris Paul. When Deron Williams was with Utah, he was deadly from anywhere on the court. People would even consider him a franchise cornerstone player. So people were really expecting that Deron Williams and Chris Paul would battle it out throughout their careers. Especially because Chris Paul is only 1 year younger than Deron Williams. Meanwhile, Chris Paul is putting up all-star numbers for the Rockets, while Deron Williams really has no way of coming back to the NBA. This begs the question as to what happened to Deron Williams. This was a player who by the age of 27 was already a 3-time All-Star and averaging 21 points, 8 assists per game, and then at the age of 29 he just falls off the map. At 29, his numbers plummeted down to 14 points per game and only 1 assist a night. But it looks like Paul Pierce might have the answers to our problems. In an article written by ESPN, Paul Pierce actually commented that he did not enjoy his time at Brooklyn at all. he was surrounded by vets who just didn't want to play or practice.
So I think it's safe to say that Deron Williams got a little too comfortable.